when Isabel de Carres suggested that there were parallels between sugar, in this case, and petroleum, I responded, why didn't I think of that? And I haven't stopped thinking about it since she suggested it about a month ago. So the presentation that I'll be making is the product of current thinking. I don't expect this to be thought of as a finished product, but I thought the idea was really inspiring, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since, causing me some considerable amount of sleep, I should say. I'm going to start by doing a discussion of where economic development theory finds itself today. And you should know that I'm going to be citing W. Arthur Lewis, St. Lucian economist, because in the 1950s, when he first presented his discussion, he had it spot on. The field drifted away over the years and now has returned. So a considerable amount of my beginning discussion will be on theory and method. I hope to make it as clear as can be. There'll be no equations that you'll have to remember, the stock and trade of economists. Diversification is the defining characteristic of the economic development experience. Diversification. It was first articulated by W. Arthur Lewis in his classic model, in which he described it as economic growth with unlimited supplies of labor. The essence of development in this way of thinking about it is the reallocation of productive resources from relatively low productivity sectors of the economy to relatively high productivity sectors. Just the shift of resources. That definition has been spectacularly confirmed by the economic growth that has occurred in formerly poor countries, particularly in Asia, during the last 4 decades, and most notably, of course, China. But what still remains an unsolved theoretical problem is why diversification occurs more rapidly in some countries than in other countries, and not at all in many countries. Guyana is among the latter. Its structure of production is not very different from what it was at the time of independence. It's true that today sugar is in decline and gold is in ascendance, but what has not happened is a movement into new, highly productive, highly remunerative industries that would propel the country forward. The most recent theoretical effort to explain why structural change may be unsatisfactorily slow focuses on the composition of a country's output as it is at the moment. The argument is that the production of new goods or new services is facilitated when the public and private competencies used in one product are also used in the production of a new product. Whether you have an old product that uses techniques that are usable in something which is not yet underway. The potential for what are called spillovers from one product to another at once reduces the risks associated with the production of the new product. So if they are similar to each other, the skills that are present in one can be used in the production of the other, making it easier to produce the other. 2 economists, Hausman and Klinger, pioneers in the field of study. Whoa, where'd it go? Gone. There it is. write that when there are spillovers, new products can be easily introduced because, here's their quotation, established industries have sorted out the many potential failures involved in assuring the availability of all the inputs needed in the new product. Seen in this perspective, structural change is slow when such spillovers are not present. That is, when existing industries employ different competencies than those that are required in the new industry. If there is a big gap between the two, it's very expensive and highly risky for the new to come into existence. If the competencies are similar to each other, then the risk of the new and the cost of going into the new is correspondingly lower. To quote Hausman and Klinger, in the absence of spillovers, here's the quotation, firms that venture into new products will find it much harder to secure the requisite inputs than if they were present. With that, with the absence of complementarities, a brake is put on innovation. Now, in the literature, the degree to which similar capabilities are used in different products is referred to as their proximity to each other, their closeness to each other, their proximity to each other. The metaphor of a forest is used to clarify the concept. Hidalgo, again, one of the people involved in this, asks us to envision a forest composed of trees, each of which is a unique product. He writes, trees that require similar capabilities are near each other in the forest. It is among proximate trees that spillovers occur, and therefore diversification is made relatively easy. Now, there's a problem with this. And the problem is that there is no straightforward way to measure the capabilities that specific industries require. And without such a measure, it is not possible to determine the potential for spillovers. So the people who work in this tradition to get around the problem of how do you measure similarities in capabilities, they use international trade and what a country exports as a measure of comparability between products. Here's their quotation. If the capabilities needed to produce two different products are similar, this would be revealed in the fact that the countries that export one good also would export the other. So now they're making a leap. They're saying, okay, if capabilities are similar, then it is likely that if they produce and export one, they will produce and export the other. That's their measure. So on this assumption, a measure of proximity is calculated. The calculation is measures the probability that for a selected pair of products, both will be exported. So that's the weakness in it, because we can't get a direct measure. So we're making the assumption that if there are similar capabilities, then both products will be exported. And they calculate a measure. And the measure you will see that they come to is on the back of the program, which does a statistic that shows the likelihood of a product being in what they call the dense forest, where the likelihood is that the product will be associated with the export of other products. I'll get to the table in a second. The table involved a great number of different products that they examined, and what they did is they went through and looked to see whether they would be if one would be exported, the other would be exported as well. The results make clear that Guyana's diversification, Guyana was handicapped both in the past and likely in the future. So let's just look at this table together, and you will see that petroleum stands isolated in the product forest. And the rough and ready translation of that is that the capabilities, the technology, the skills that are required in the petroleum industry are not shared very much with other industries. And in this regard, petroleum stands alone as the most isolated. What you'll also see as you go through this table is that agricultural products tend also to be relatively in isolated parts of the forest. And it is only when you get to manufacturing, even labor-intensive manufacturing, that the coefficient that they came to, the number that they have put on this table, indicates that the capabilities are relatively proximate. So spillovers, the translation from this table is that spillovers are more likely to occur in an economy that is using manufacturing, in which the composition of output is manufacturing, less likely to achieve this kind of easy diversification if the economy is dominated by agriculture. And as you can see, the petroleum is an industry in which, because of the unique characteristics used in its production, is the least likely to have spillovers, and therefore a economy dominated by petroleum is going to have a very hard time diversifying if compensatory activity is not undertaken. That's the bad news. A little more upbeat is about to follow. It's important not to overstate the negative consequences of specializing in a product that produces few positive spillovers. Diversification is not thereby precluded, though it is made more difficult to achieve. And so this then is the parallel between sugar and petroleum. Each stands in its own isolated place in the product forest. Each, therefore, puts a brake on diversification. And that's a problem, because diversification is the essence of the process of economic development. Now, why it's possible to avoid this problem in the first instance is in particular because petroleum generates large volumes of revenue and large volumes of foreign exchange. And these are resources that can be used to promote diversification despite the absence of spillovers. But revenue alone does not ensure diversification. To achieve structural change, the revenue must be used to alter the trajectory of the economy from what it otherwise would be, and what it otherwise would be is not experiencing diversification because there are few spillovers. So a big burden then is put on policy. What is needed to achieve such a redirection is a purposeful intervention by the government. Now, in considering this possibility, Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize economist, discussion of the experience in Korea is of great relevance. In the early 1960s, Stiglitz argues that Korea was a country that specialized in rice. It is an industry that has few spillovers, and Stiglitz argues that Korea could have continued to have been a rice producer and would have become an excellent rice producer. And his quotation is, "The country might today have been among the most efficient rice farmers, but it would still be a poor country." It was the Korean government that diversified the economy away from rice. The interventions necessary to achieve diversification in the absence of spillovers will differ according to a country's factor endowments and resources. No two countries are the same in this regard. The people working in this tradition have offered some suggestions about how to do it. They are kind of generic and not very specific to any individual Caribbean country. But what is required to escape the consequences of isolation in the product forest is to look beyond customary output and methods of production and figure out how the business people in the country can become better innovators. Figure out what it would take for them to be what we economists call Schumpeterian entrepreneurs, business people who will innovate. Now, the fact is that more than 30 years ago, Professor C.Y. Thomas mapped out just such an approach for Guyana, and in particular, for Guyana in particular, and for the CARICOM countries more generally. In response to the threat to the region's sugar industry emanating from the growth of high fructose corn syrup, Professor Thomas delved deeply into the chemistry of sugar. He did so in order to propose a development strategy that would use sucrose as the feedstock for a chemical industry. He wrote, "It is clear that if a chemical industry based on sucrose could become technically and commercially viable, a significant advance in the cause of Caribbean development would have been made. If there had been the diversification away from sugar alone to sugar as the feedstock for a chemical industry, that would have represented the kind of diversification that Arthur Lewis was talking about, the shifting of resources from relatively low productivity to relatively high productivity sectors." Though Thomas was optimistic concerning the potential that lay in that direction, he nevertheless reported that, quote, "the technical problems that remain in this field are considerable." There are technical problems that make this a difficult thing to do, and that goes back to the fact that there are no spillovers that are available. To overcome the technical difficulties, Thomas hoped that the region would be able to enlist the assistance of the sugar refining multinational that dominated the industry at the time, Tate and Lyle. As Thomas described it, the firm was, quote, "in fact, the world-leading institution in the field of sucrochemicals," end quote, and going on, "this considerable asset should not be easily given up or worse, wasted." Thomas's recommendation was that the governments of the region should consider an agreement aimed at joint research, work on technology, work on development of the industry, work on production of the industry, and the marketing of sucrochemicals with Tate and Lyle. In support of such an effort, he proposed establishing a regional venture capital fund financed with a levy on sugar production. Now, the problem was that Tate and Lyle at the time had begun phasing down its sugar research and development and was redirecting its efforts away from sugar. Furthermore, Thomas was unable to enlist the interest of the regional governments in his proposal. Near the end of his short little book, he reported that prior to the publication of his study, he had circulated it to the CARICOM governments. And what I think is kind of an understatement, he wrote that after 2 years, quote, regional reaction has been modest. I take that to mean something a little more strong than modest, but that's the way he wrote it. In the future, petroleum will probably be as dominant in Guyana as sugar has been historically. But because petroleum, like sugar, occupies an isolated part of the product forest, it will not be alone a fertile source of diversification. Now, what petroleum will do is provide the country with revenue flows that are far in excess of what sugar ever did. And therein lies Guyana's potential for structural change. Diversification efforts that rely on petroleum will not fail because of a tight budget constraint. But it is true that the natural resource curse, and specifically the threat of Dutch disease, could derail the effort. If petroleum exports are allowed to, for example, overvalue the Guyana dollar, or the industry's revenues are not efficiently employed to achieve the diversification, new sectors of economic activity will fail to mature. But whatever else is the case, the government will almost certainly possess sufficient revenues to pay for the programs that will facilitate diversification. One strategy to achieve structural change, building out from petroleum, will involve what is called domestic content. Local firms supplying inputs to the multinational. The idea here is that if the petroleum firms agree to be supplied with products and services for their operations from local sources, and, very importantly, those local sources are able to match global standards with regard to quality and price, the Guyanese economy will relocate to a more dense part of the product forest than it has ever experienced. Even labor-intensive manufacturing, if you take a look at the table, even labor-intensive manufacturing, the kinds of intermediate products that are likely to be produced by local firms, is a stronger source of spillovers than, for example, sugar or, of course, petroleum. But for this transformation to occur, for local firms to learn to be effective suppliers to the multinational, the government will have to develop policies and institutions that encourage, on one hand, the multinational energy firm to buy from the domestic firms, while at the same time paying for programs to help those local firms to respond effectively to the needs of the petroleum exporter. In short, Guyana is being given a second chance. Petroleum will provide the country with the opportunity with petroleum that it failed to seize with sugar. Neither of those two industries is the source of extensive spillovers. Neither, therefore, stimulates economic structural change in the absence of government policy. Nevertheless, diversification is achievable. Success, however, is contingent upon successful implementation of government policies that strengthen the capability of the local firms that seek to supply the multinational. In the 1980s, C.Y. Thomas proposed such a diversification strategy building on sugar, but his strategy failed to gain traction. Today, the providing of domestic content to the multinational energy firms represents a similar possibility. But for such a strategy to succeed, the indifference that the government exhibited in the past must not be repeated. That is the challenge that faces Guyana as it approaches the turning point in its history that becoming a petroleum exporter represents. Thank you for listening to me.